Hi everyone, and welcome to the first week of our course, Ethical and Clinical Issues in End-of-Life Care. I'm Dr. Pamela Ludmer, Director of the fourth year curriculum here, and Dr. Ira Bedzo and I created this course together. And in this course, you will learn about the ethical issues that relate to end-of-life care. You will also learn about the various ethical approaches that you should use to consider how to respond to questions that relate to end-of-life care. Each week we will focus on a different topic, such as futility, the right to refuse treatment, palliative care, death with dignity, and so on. And in each session you will apply the teachings of the week in our discussions and the weekly assignments. So by the end of today's session, you will be able to discuss the ethical perspectives relevant to patient care, contrast internal versus external medical ethics, apply the 4 topics approach to ethical dilemmas, and reflect on your personal challenges in taking care of patients at the end of life. So first we're going to start off by discussing the 4 major ethical frameworks or approaches that are used to examine questions related to end-of-life care. These frameworks provide a guideline for how to make moral, ethical decisions. They are Kantianism, also known as deontology or the duty-based approach, consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is an ends-based approach, principlism, the principle-based approach, and virtue ethics or the habit-based approach. This one is a little bit different because it's more about developing a readiness to act in a moral or ethical way. And none of these approaches is the right approach, but they all complement each other, and they each should be used together to come up with the most ethical, moral solution. So we're going to start off and talk a bit about the Kantian approach, or the deontological approach. So this one is a little bit challenging, but it's really popular in medical ethics, so it's important to know about it. In general, the focus here is on doing your duty without regard for the consequences of that duty. And there are 2 different ways to express this approach. One is treat everyone as an ends and not merely as a means. And the second is act in such a way that your actions can be construed as a universal moral law. Okay, so what does that actually mean? So in other words, you want to treat a person in such a way that it does not solely consider the benefit to someone else. So the person themselves should not be used to achieve something else. They shouldn't be manipulated, and they should not be treated as an inanimate object. The other part is that we need to act in a way that can be seen as a universal rule that is applicable in all situations. In other words, don't lie, and you would always apply that rule regardless. So those things sound good, but there are actually a few problems with this approach. For example, one, you could say that you should tell a person that his or her test results came out positive for HIV, even though you know that person will kill himself or herself as a result of that news. So your action will occur regardless of knowing that there's a negative outcome. You know something bad is going to happen, but you need to do a certain action anyway. Another situation could be when there are conflicting responsibilities, like a case where maintaining confidentiality might harm another person. So in this case, you would need to follow a rule despite knowing that there's a negative outcome. Again, that rule being confidentiality, regardless of knowing that there are negative consequences as a result of following that rule. Then the third issue with this is that this approach considers the physician's moral perspective as being totally objective and therefore universally applicable. But we know that this isn't true. If it was, all doctors would always act the same way. But we don't. We all have different cultural and religious backgrounds and different perspectives and priorities. But the Kantian approach doesn't take that into account. So the problems, again, are that you'll act away despite knowing there's a negative outcome. You have to follow a rule despite knowing there's a negative outcome. And this approach assumes that all physicians are totally objective, which we really are not. So now we're going to move on to the next approach. So basically, this attempt attempts to maximize the well-being of the people involved and attempts to minimize harm. So what does that mean? So there are two different types of utilitarians, the act utilitarians and the rule utilitarians. As you can see here, the act utilitarians think that you can act in a way based on the likely outcome of that act. In other words, you decide to tell the truth based on the consequences of either doing so or not. So you know that you will achieve someone's highest well-being by doing a certain action. Rule utilitarians, just like it sounds, imposes moral rules on utility. So in this case, you might decide to tell the truth if there's a general rule that would lead you to tell the truth in a given situation. So the rule utilitarians still want to achieve well-being, but they add some sort of a moral rule to help them with that decision-making process. So for example, while act utilitarians judge whether or not to tell the truth by the consequences of any given situation, they will still seek to achieve the highest well-being, while rule utilitarians will also consider the benefit of having a general rule that one should tell the truth. It's not that this rule should be followed indiscriminately, only that it looks beyond the immediate consequences of someone's well-being. So if you think about it, act utilitarians could justify never telling the truth, which would result in a great long-term harm, while rule utilitarians mitigate that by emphasizing the benefit in generally telling the truth. So in other words, while consequentialists, both sides, focus on well-being, the act utilitarians focus on the short-term well-being, while rule utilitarians factor in the following of a moral rule for long-term well-being. So those are the Kantian approaches and the consequentialism approaches. So just to clarify again, so the Kantian approach basically says that the end does not justify the means. You have to look at somebody as an individual person and not treat them as a means, while the consequentialists say that the ends do justify the means and you want to achieve the highest possible and the best possible outcome. I'm going to move on to the next approach, the third approach, which is principlism. And this is probably the one you're most familiar with. Principlism, or the four principles approach to medical ethics, identifies four basic moral principles as the starting point for practical decision-making. The four principles are respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. And these terms are probably familiar to you. You've probably heard them all before. So in thinking about a medical ethics case, a person would balance these four principles in light of the goals of medicine to make a proper moral decision. So there are 6 conditions that were set aside by the two philosophers who devised this approach, and they said that these 6 conditions should be met when trying to balance these 4 principles. So the first one is that when you prioritize one over another, you should have a good reason to prioritize that one over any of the other ones. 2, what you choose to prioritize needs to result in a realistic chance of success. So whatever you choose needs to have a likely chance of having a good outcome. 3, that the choice that you prioritize must be the best alternative. 4, the choice that you make has taken all the other principles into account. 5, that again, what you choose, what you prioritize will result in the fewest negative consequences. And 6, that all parties involved have been treated impartially. So it might seem that principlism is just another form of consequentialism, since it does focus on minimizing negative consequences, just like consequentialism did. The difference between them is that the utilitarian consequentialism approach attempts to maximize one principle, that is of happiness or well-being, while principlism attempts to maximize all 4 principles that we talked about already. Now, one criticism of principlism is that each of the 4 principles are inherently vague and potentially subjective. We're going to look at that in terms of autonomy right now. So physicians must respect autonomy of their patients, right? one of the things we talk about all the time. This means that doctors can't assert control or put restraints on their patients' decisions, and they need to provide them with enough information for them to make rational decisions. But to use autonomy, and when we think about autonomy, we have to consider two other things. One is liberty, and the other is the concept of agency. And then agency also has two parts. One is intentionality, and the other is understanding. So, for example, what really is liberty? Is it the right to be free from interference from others? Or is it an entitlement right, where a person has the right to receive something? Then when we think about intentionality and understanding, those two both assume that a patient has the mental capacity or competence, and that the physician discloses all the relevant information needed to understand the situation and possible options, and that the context of the encounter allows the patient to choose voluntarily what the next steps should be. So the problem with all of this is that all these factors will be different depending on the situation and the people involved, making it hard to create a general principle. Also, each of these four principles have a high degree of sophistication and nuance, which makes it difficult to balance them against each other in decision making. So in terms of problems so far with principlism, we have that the concepts are vague, that the concepts are very nuanced, and the result of all of this is that it makes it very difficult to figure out which of the principles to balance. So again, using just principlism can be very challenging. So this is going to take us to our fourth and last approach for today, which is the virtue ethics approach. So before 1847, medical ethics was thought to be a personal ethics that came from the physician's understanding of his or her role and duties, and it was symbolized by an oath, like the Hippocratic Oath, the idea of first do no harm. Medical ethics, then, was about the virtues and the habits of the physician, and less about the deliberation of particular acts or the actual patient-physician relationship. But as the medical profession grew and medical education became more widespread, physicians began to differ in both medical practice and ethical thinking in terms of goals and how to properly care for patients. So the medical profession looked to standardize its ethical recommendations and to make sure that its physicians kept to a moral standard of care. So the first National Professional Code of Ethics for any profession was the 1847 American Medical Association Code of Ethics. So the transition from medical ethics being based in personal conviction to being based on professional code had some consequences. The code did standardize ethical decisions for medical situations, but it essentially gave professional consensus moral authority over any person's individual conscience. So it didn't really matter what the physician wanted to do. It was a professional consensus that would lead to whatever choice happened. So regardless of what any physician thought or felt, there was only one ethical way to practice. Things are a little different now with the AMA's code allowing for conscientious objection when performing a certain practice which goes against a physician's personal religious or moral beliefs, but it wasn't always like that. So medical ethics changed from being a character-based morality to becoming primarily a conduct-based morality, where questions of medical ethics were more about what to do in a situation and not necessarily which values, attitudes, beliefs, or character traits a physician should adopt and convey as a physician. Today, while the development of virtues is essential for physicians, the virtue approach in ethical decision-making is really just a supplementary approach to medical ethics. Okay, so to summarize, we talked about the Kantianism approach, the duty-based approach, consequentialism, or the ends-based approach, principlism, with autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, and the virtue or the habits-based approach. So if you want to take a little break right now before we go on, you can pause it, the presentation. If anything is unclear, go back and listen to it again or reread some of these things. But if not, we're going to continue on with the last bit of the presentation. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the external versus internal concept of medical ethics. So what do we mean by this? So you can think of medical ethics as either coming internally from the goals and practices of the medical profession itself, or you can see it as part of the ethics of society as a whole. And this becomes important when you think that the patient-physician relationship is becoming influenced more and more by the patient's moral views and less by the priorities of the medical profession as a whole. And this is something that really comes into play, especially in end-of-life care. So the internal view sees medical ethics as the ethics of the medical profession. That means that physicians as a group have agreed upon certain standards and duties as part of their roles, and they all agree to uphold those standards and duties. Medical professional ethics, then, comes from the values held by the medical profession, and only the medical profession, not by anybody else. So it is therefore the ethics that are internal to the medical profession. Now that doesn't mean that medical ethics is wholly independent of societal ethics, but it means that the professional values that the medical profession upholds has a tradition that has been influenced by both societal norms and the history of the medical profession itself. Now, the external view says simply that the ethics of society is applied to all medical situations. In this view, there is no such thing as medical morality per se. The general moral rules and guidelines by which we live our lives are the same as those that physicians use in the practice of their profession. The term medical ethics, then, is used to categorize the set of ethical issues that occur in medical situations and is based on the ethics of the whole society, not just physicians. So this position is found in John Bell's introduction to that first 1847 American Medical Association Code of Ethics, where he writes, "Medical ethics, as a branch of general ethics, must rest on the basis of religion and morality." And now there's actually a compromise view that states medical ethics develops from the interaction of the goals of the medical profession and societal demands or moral claims. This is the mixed view. So a good example of this mixed view is in the diversity of medical ethics across different religious and cultural communities. While there are many similarities among them, due to the internal values of the practice of medicine, there are also differences that stem from differing moral priorities or values across different cultures and religions. Another thing to take into account is the legal system, and this really plays a part in the external view of medical ethics. State interests or public advocacy will often influence medical ethics through legislation or court decision, as has been the case again very often in issues of end-of-life care. It's not that medical ethics is determined by healthcare legislation, but that as a profession within a broader society, medical ethics may have to adapt to fit the changing social norms, or it may, at times, be in tension and in conflict with the new legal reality. And this is something that is going on now, and we'll certainly talk more about, especially in our Death with Dignity module. So for this reason, the AMA Code of Ethics states the following. Ethical values and legal principles are usually closely related, but ethical obligations typically exceed legal duties. In some cases, the law mandates unethical conduct. In general, when physicians believe a law is unjust, they should work to change the law. In exceptional circumstances of unjust laws, ethical responsibilities should supersede legal obligations. The fact that a physician charged with allegedly illegal conduct is acquitted or exonerated in civil or criminal proceedings does not necessarily mean that the physician acted ethically. So again, this is really a big issue now with all the Death with Dignity legislation. So hopefully you will be able to come to your own conclusions about how you might handle such an issue when you're faced with that kind of an issue in your own practice. So these were our learning objectives that we started off with. Discuss the ethical perspectives relevant to patient care, contrast internal versus external medical ethics, and then these last two, apply the four topics approach to ethical dilemmas and reflect on personal challenges in taking care of patients at the end of life, will come up more in our discussions, in your readings, and in your assignments. So if you have any questions, feel free to let either Dr. Bedzo or let me know, and we look forward to hearing from you in the discussion boards. Thanks for your attention.